Imagine the terror of waking up on an ordinary morning, a devoted father, only to have your world shattered by an unimaginable accusation that you committed something terrible against your own daughter, cruelly and repeatedly accused in your own home, leading you to a nightmare of chains, concrete walls, and 40 long years in the most unforgiving maximum security prison in the United States, all while screaming your innocence to ears that refused to listen. In the quiet suburbs of a sleepy Midwestern town, where white picket fences framed manicured lawns and neighbors waved cordially, lived John Harlan, a man whose life seemed as ordinary as the rustle of autumn leaves. John was 42 years old, working as a mechanic in a local auto shop, always with a smile and a kind word. His wife, Emily, was a sweet and kind teacher, and their daughter, Sarah, had just turned 18, dreaming of college and freedom. But behind that facade of normality lurked an invisible storm, fueled by rumors, lies, and a system hungry for convictions. It all began with an anonymous call to Child Protective Services, laden with venomous accusations, alleging that John had been abusing Sarah since she was 16, distorted details that painted him as a monster. The police stormed their home at dawn, like predators, breaking down the door, guns drawn, screams echoing as John was dragged away in his underwear, handcuffed so tightly that his wrists bled. Emily screamed in despair. Sarah stood motionless in the hallway, her eyes wide with confusion or perhaps something darker, and John could only repeat, "This isn't real. I didn't do this. I love my family." His father's arrest hit the local media like a bombshell. Headlines blared with slogans like, "Father accused of abusing his own daughter, the nightmare revealed." Reporters surrounded the house, shoving microphones in Emily's face as she sobbed as she denied everything. John was thrown into a filthy county jail, where the hostility of the other inmates mixed with the indifference of the guards. On the first night, a cellmate cornered him, hurling threats of what often befalls those accused of such crimes. John cowered in the corner, his mind wandering back to Sarah's childhood, teaching her to ride a bike, tending to her scraped knees, innocent hugs that now became evidence against him. The prosecution's case was built like a burning house of cards. Sarah testified in court, her voice trembling, describing nights when John allegedly entered her room and subjected her to forced acts. She spoke of pain, of shame, of a burden that nearly brought her to the brink of death. Medical examinations revealed old marks consistent with violence. Defense attorney Mark, an overworked public defender, argued that it was all fabricated, perhaps the result of Sarah's rebelliousness or outside influence, but the jury saw only a predator. And then came the final proof, biological evidence found on underwear that matched John's profile. It was the blow that sealed his fate. "Guilty," declared the jury foreman, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. The judge, a stern woman with no compassion for defendants of that ilk, struck the gavel. 40 years in Ironwood maximum security prison, with no possibility of parole before 25. Ironwood was hell on earth itself, a fortress of steel and suffering built in the arid lands of northern Michigan, where winters froze the soul and summers burned the blood. John arrived in chains, exposed to guards who humiliated him with cruel insults and looks of contempt, treating him as if he were less than human. Every step inside that place felt like a deeper plunge into the abyss of damnation. His cell, a suffocating space barely 6 feet tall, was a kind of concrete coffin he would have to share with Rico, a tattooed giant sentenced to life in prison for a brutal crime. At first, Rico regarded him as just another fragile prey in this ecosystem of predators, but he eventually became a reluctant protector, intrigued by John's story. "Innocent, is he? Everyone here says so," he murmured suspiciously. But he still taught him the basic rules: keep your head down, don't align with factions, and never back down when challenged. The days dragged on in a crushing routine. The metallic clang of bars woke everyone at 5 in the morning, followed by an inedible breakfast, a pasty concoction that seemed designed to kill dignity more than hunger. Then came endless hours in the prison workshop, hammering metal plates under the watchful eye of guards who shouted orders like generals on a battlefield. At night, however, was when the true terror spread through the corridors. Screams echoed off the walls, the wails of men being beaten, threatened, or used as targets for others' brutality. John witnessed horrors that haunted him, scenes of violence and degradation that made him tremble silently inside his cell. He wondered, night after night, if that would be his fate as well. As the years passed, hope slowly eroded. John wrote letters to Emily, begging for visits, for any sign of support. But one day he received the final answer, an envelope with a divorce petition and a cold message that simply said, "You are dead to us." The words seemed pierced with tears, but they sealed his fate once and for all. Sarah never recanted her testimony. Her voice in court remained the invisible rope that suffocated him each day. Even so, John refused to surrender completely to despair. He discovered the legal study group within the prison, where inmates sought legal loopholes to prove their innocence. He spent hours in the small library, delving into law books and miscarriage of justice cases. There he learned that DNA found could have been transferred indirectly, that medical marks could originate from other situations. But his appeals were systematically denied, judges labeling him a man trying to cling to desperate lies. Ironwood's violence did not spare him either. On one occasion, he was attacked by another inmate for a trivial reason, a misinterpreted exchange of glances. A blow with a makeshift blade tore his face open, leaving a permanent scar that burned more from the guard's indifference, who laughed as the blood flowed, than from physical pain. Without adequate medical care, John stitched his own wound with threads torn from his uniform, feeling the constant reminder of his fragility in his flesh. The first decade dragged on until it fused into the second, and John began to find resistance in small, silent rebellions. He smuggled books about the cases of innocent convicts, stories that gave him the strength to believe there was still a chance to prove the truth. Cases like the West Memphis 3 became an inspiration, showing that even against all odds, justice could sometimes be overturned. Driven by this hope, he contacted outside organizations, such as the Innocence Project, which fought for wrongfully convicted inmates. Lawyers visited him, skeptical at first, but soon discovered cracks in the story. Old testimony suggested that Sarah had been in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend at the time, an unstable young man named Tyler, who had a history of violence. There were indications that the marks might have come from him, and rumors swirled that Sarah might have fabricated the story to escape home, perhaps out of fear of an unwanted pregnancy. But even with these discoveries, the evidence was too flimsy to overturn the conviction. Appeals were again denied. The weight of hopelessness led John to consider ending it all. One night, sitting in his cell, he clutched a smuggled shard of glass, staring at his distorted reflection as he considered slitting his wrists and letting his life go down the drain. But before he could, Rico intervened with a sharp punch to the wall and harsh words. "Don't give them that pleasure. You won't give up, you'll fight until the end." And these words echoed within John like a spark of survival. Even faced with the endless darkness of Ironwood, even after losing his family, his freedom, and almost his identity, he decided that he would not be defeated. The following years were a slow martyrdom, but also the beginning of a silent transformation within John. He was no longer the man who entered Ironwood with chains on his wrists and fear in his eyes. The deep lines on his face and graying hair showed the weight of time, but in his eyes there was something new, an almost unbreakable determination. Rico, his cellmate, became more than a protector. He became an anchor. In the silence of the long nights, they talked about regrets, choices, and life outside the walls. John spoke of Emily and Sarah, remembering happy times, even if they were now tainted by pain. Rico, in turn, confessed to crimes he could never undo, but said that his friendship with John was the only thing that made him feel human again. It was on one of these nights that John had a revelation. If he couldn't easily prove his innocence, he could at least leave a record. He began writing his memoirs in smuggled notebooks, each page a mixture of pain and hope, denouncing the system's flaws and telling his version of events. Some manuscripts ended up in the hands of volunteers from the Innocence Project, who decided to revisit the case more thoroughly. Time was against John, but something was changing. Almost 30 years after his conviction, a breakthrough finally emerged. New DNA analysis techniques, unavailable in the 1990s, revealed that the evidence against him was flimsy and inconclusive. Furthermore, Tyler, Sarah's ex-boyfriend, was arrested in another state for domestic violence. During an investigation, old testimony resurfaced, linking him to assaults that matched the marks cited in John's trial. Public pressure, fueled by journalists who had access to the prison notebooks, reignited the debate on the case. The court reopened the case. For the first time in decades, John returned to his civilian clothes, albeit simple ones, and found himself before judges and prosecutors. The world outside was no longer the same. Cell phones, the internet, new faces on the streets. His own reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger, but within him still pulsed the hope of hearing the words he had always awaited. When the review ruling was read, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The original evidence is found to be flawed. The defendant, John Harlan, is officially exonerated. The news spread like wildfire, headlines bearing phrases John never believed he would read. Innocent man freed after nearly 3 decades. But freedom came with a profound emptiness. Emily had died years earlier in a car accident, and Sarah, now an adult, never sought out her father again. He left prison with a plastic bag, few belongings, and a scar that scarred more than just his skin. It scarred the soul of someone who lost everything to prove the obvious, that he was innocent. In the months that followed, John tried to rebuild his life. He slept in shelters, spoke at universities about miscarriages of justice, and slowly became a voice against the injustices of the system. His notebooks were published as a book, moving readers and serving as a warning about how many lives were still being crushed behind iron bars. But silently, John carried the greatest loss, never having regained his daughter's love. The end of his story was not one of complete redemption, but of resistance. He didn't recover the stolen time, nor his destroyed family, but he did recover something Ironwood had tried to take from him from day one, his dignity. And as he walked the icy streets of Michigan, the wind biting his aging face, John repeated to himself the phrase that had kept his flame alive all those years. "They didn't break me. I survived."